Welcome back. Here's a look at where markets ended the week after a slew of big tech earnings and new economic data. The three major indices extending steep losses for the month. And of course, it has been a rough beginning to the second quarter for markets. The Federal Reserve's favorite inflation gauge coming in slightly higher than expected on Friday, annually showing a growth of 2.7%, with monthly inflation remaining flat at up 0.3%. The economy is also slowing down, growing, but slower than expected in the first quarter at 1.6% compared to the expectations of 2.4% and all the way down from 4.9% in the third quarter of last year. The Federal Reserve's next policy meeting is on deck for this upcoming Tuesday and Wednesday. Let's get ahead of it right now with former Federal Reserve Governor Kevin Warsh. And Kevin, it's great to see you. Thanks very much for joining us this weekend. I want to get your take on where we are in terms of the inflation story and the growth story. How would you assess the macro story today?
So I think the number one takeaway is that inflation continues to eat away at real incomes. Real take-home pay is not keeping up with the surge in prices over the last several years. This mix of policies from the Biden administration, so the Biden-Yellen-Powell axis, I think is doing real harm to prices. The average basket of prices that a typical consumer would pay is up well more than 20% in the last few years. Real take-home wages are up about half of that. So no wonder the American people feel as though they need a change in policies.
Well, we're getting sticker shock every time we go to the grocery store, for sure, because you've got all the essentials rising. Look at gasoline, up 52% on Joe Biden's watch. Consumer prices up 18.9%. Credit card debt up 46%. Wages are down in the middle of all of that, down 2.5% on real hourly wages. And I want to get your take on why it's been so tough to get inflation down. The Democrats' policy, Inflation Reduction Act, Fiscal Responsibility Act, CHIPS Act, green energy tax credits, forgiveness of student loan debt. How are we going to get inflation under control if we keep seeing this level of spending?
So in a word, we won't. So America's inflation problem is not because workers are somehow working too much, earning too much, or living too well. America's inflation problem is because the government's living too well. They're spending too much and they're printing too much. You know, the old excuses that we heard about inflation's because of the pandemic, inflation's because of the war. Now they say it's because of supply chain. It makes this group of policymakers sound like they're bystanders to this. No, they're not. Central banks can determine the level of inflation, and I'm afraid because this central bank, with this mix of spending policies and printing policies, waited so long to raise rates from zero. They let inflation find their way into the body politic. They let inflation find their way into expectations. Then they had to raise rates more than they otherwise would have. And I think more recently, the problem is then they declared victory prematurely. In December, Marie, as you well know, the Fed said they'd be cutting rates this year, that the inflation dragon had been quashed, had been killed, only to find in the recent days and weeks that that isn't true. They, in some sense, talked down the policy rate a couple of months ago, and inflation has resurfaced. And again, it's the most regressive tax that any administration can come up with. And the blame isn't just with the central bank. It's with that mix of tax and spending and regulatory policies, which are doing real harm to the American worker.
Yeah, and I want to get to taxes in a moment. But ahead of this meeting, this upcoming week, the FOMC meeting, what do you think the priorities are in terms of what Jay Powell may say, given that it feels like he wants to cut interest rates? But how can he if inflation is not where he wants it and if the spike in prices continues elevated? Is he going to give us guidance, do you think? How will he manage that in this meeting?
Well, I hope they stop giving us guidance. It is a recent Fed innovation over the last several years that policymakers should keep talking, should keep giving their forecast, their dots. How many cuts do they have in the upcoming year? I think it's been a policy error when they talked in December that they had all these cuts to come, that inflation was beaten. They talked down the policy rate and inflation surged. Listen, my best advice is they should stop giving this forward guidance. The most important policy tool the central bank has isn't actually its printing press. it's its credibility. And I worry a lot, Maria, that its credibility has been strained by these errors that are systematic about prices, about the real economy. I hope when Chairman Powell and his colleagues meet this upcoming week, they talk a little less and they think a little bit more. The world's a mess out there, and making crazy forecasts in this period is only going to make them, I think, put them in more trouble as the year goes on.
Meanwhile, we're taxed to the max. So much for middle class. Joe's big campaign promise that he's not going to raise taxes on anybody making less than $400,000 a year. If he allows the Trump $2 trillion tax cuts to expire, the Tax Foundation is warning that a single person making $30,000 a year could pay an additional $250 in taxes. Individuals making $75,000 could see their taxes jump by more than $1,700. House Republicans have now formed 10 tax teams aimed at finding legislative solutions for the expiring tax cuts. What do you think will happen here, or should happen, in terms of these upcoming expiring tax cuts?
So, Marie, it might be unpopular to say it, but I thought it at the time. I'll say it again. The Trump tax cuts worked. They raised real incomes for the middle class. They made the economy more productive. It led to a surge in capital investment. And the truth is that the majority of benefits of the Trump tax cuts help the working middle class. There are, of course, benefits across the tax code for people of all incomes. But the corporate tax cuts made U.S. multinationals more competitive, more productive. That finds its way into wages. To increase taxes, to revoke the Trump tax cuts would be a mistake. And again, this policy axis we see in Washington between the White House, the Treasury, and the Fed that lead to a bigger government, bigger spending, that's quite dangerous. I'll just end with one fact. The U.S. government today, Maria, is more than 40% bigger than the day before COVID. That's a problem, and they might think that the right answer is to tax our way to solve that revenue problem, but that's not the way to do it. It's to shrink the size of the government, and for each of these agencies in the government, like the central bank, they need to stick to the remit. And for the Fed, the remit is to get prices stable, and they certainly aren't right now.
Yeah, all great points. So important, Kevin. Thanks very much for joining us.